The year is 1887. The Great Plains are a powder keg of tension between settlers, carving out a new life, and the Comanche, the lords of the plains, whose way of life is vanishing like breath in the biting winter air. For 10-year-old Vivian, the world is already a place of shadows, a darkness that stole her sight years ago. But when a cataclysmic blizzard, a white death, descends upon the unforgiving landscape, she is plunged into a new, more terrifying blackness. Abandoned in the heart of the storm, her only hope lies in the voice of a young Comanche boy, a voice that cuts through the howling wind with a song of his ancestors, a song that might just lead her home. The wind, a restless spirit on the vast open plains of the Texas Panhandle, had been whispering warnings for days. It was a low, mournful sound that snaked through the tall, brittle stalks of last season's corn in the fields surrounding the homestead of the Miller family. It was a sound that made the cattle restless in their lean-to and caused the flames in the hearth to dance with an agitated fervor. Elias Miller, a man whose face was a road map of hard-won years and relentless sun, stood on his porch, his hand shielding his eyes as he scanned the northern horizon. The sky was a peculiar shade of bruised purple, a color he had come to associate with nature's foulest moods. He had seen skies like this before, had felt this same preternatural stillness that preceded the unleashed fury of a plains blizzard. He was a man who understood the delicate, often brutal contract one signed with this land. It gave, but it also took, and it demanded a constant, wary respect. "Looks mean, Pa," a voice said from the doorway. It was his eldest son, 16-year-old Thomas, his frame already sturdy from the ceaseless labor of the farm. Elias spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Means there's a rattler in a fire. We need to get the last of the herd in, and check the ties on the barn roof. If this is what I think it is, it'll try to peel it off like a lid on a can." Inside the small but meticulously kept sod house, Martha Miller moved with a practiced efficiency. She was a woman of quiet strength. Her hands, though calloused, were gentle as they kneaded dough for the evening's bread. Her face, still holding the ghost of a youthful beauty, was etched with the fine lines of worry. She, too, had heard the wind's ominous tune. Her gaze fell upon her daughter Vivian, who sat by the fire, her small hands methodically braiding a length of twine. Vivian was 10, with hair the color of spun corn silk, and eyes that were a startling milky blue. They were eyes that saw nothing of the world around her, not since the fever had claimed her sight 4 years ago. The darkness that had enveloped her then was a constant, unchanging landscape. She navigated the familiar terrain of the house with a grace that often made visitors forget her affliction. Her other senses sharpened to a preternatural degree. She could distinguish her brother's footsteps from her father's, could tell by the scent in the air what her mother was cooking, and could feel the subtle shifts in temperature that heralded a change in the weather. "The air tastes of iron, Mama." Vivian said, her voice soft but clear. It was her own way of describing the metallic tang of the cold that preceded a deep freeze. Martha's hands stilled on the dough. "Aye, little one. It's the breath of the north wind. But we are safe and warm in here. Your father and Thomas are seeing to the animals." Vivian nodded, but her small face was taut with a tension that mirrored her mother's. She had no visual memory of a blizzard, but she had the stories, the hushed, fearful tones of her parents recounting the great die-ups, the tales of settlers found frozen just yards from their own front doors, their sense of direction stolen by the blinding, disorienting whiteout. She had the feel of it in her bones, a deep primal dread that the unseen could be the most terrifying of all. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to a leaden grey, and the first flakes of snow, tiny and granular, began to fall. They were not the soft, feathery flakes of a gentle winter's day, but hard, stinging pellets that bounced off the frozen ground. The wind, which had been a mournful whisper, was now a rising howl, a chorus of 1,000 grieving voices. Elias and Thomas stumbled back into the house, their faces raw and red from the biting cold. They were covered in a fine dusting of snow, their beards and eyebrows already rimed with ice. "It's a bad one, Martha," Elias said, his voice grim, as he unwound the thick scarf from his neck. "Came on faster than a spooked horse. We got the cattle in, but the wind is a devil." As the afternoon bled into a premature, inky twilight, the full force of the blizzard descended. It was no longer snowing in any conventional sense. The air itself had become a swirling vortex of white, a relentless horizontal assault that erased the world beyond the cabin's single window. The wind shrieked and clawed at the sod walls, and the small house trembled under the onslaught. Inside, the Millers drew together a small island of warmth and light in a vast ocean of frigid chaos. They ate their supper in a subdued silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the relentless roar of the storm. Elias read from the family Bible, his voice a low, steady rumble against the tempest's fury. But even the familiar words of the Psalms seemed to be swallowed by the storm's immensity. Later, as they prepared for bed, a sudden violent gust of wind slammed against the house, and with a sickening crack, the latch on the heavy wooden door gave way. The door flew open, and a maelstrom of snow and ice burst into the room, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into a swirling, frigid darkness. "The door!" Elias roared, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Thomas, help me!" They fought against the storm's fury, their bodies straining to force the heavy door back into its frame. Martha, her heart pounding, fumbled for the matches to relight the lantern. Vivian, in the sudden, chaotic darkness, felt a surge of panic. The familiar, ordered world of her home had been breached, and the cold, the raw, terrifying cold, was a living thing in the room. In the confusion, a half-grown calf, one of the runts they had brought inside to save from the initial chill, spooked by the sudden noise and cold, bolted out of the open door and into the blizzard's maw. "The calf," Thomas yelled. "Pa, it's the one Vivian named Snowdrop." Vivian's heart clenched. Snowdrop was her favorite, a gentle creature whose soft, wet nose she knew by touch. "Snowdrop!" she cried out, her small voice lost in the storm's roar. "Stay here," Elias commanded, finally managing to slam the door shut. "Thomas, we have to bar it. The latch is broken." They worked frantically, their breath coming in ragged, frosted plumes. But Vivian, her mind consumed with the image of the small, defenseless calf alone in the storm, did something she had never done before. Overcome with a desperate, childish impulse, she pulled her thick woolen shawl tighter around her, and when her father and brother were preoccupied with securing the door, she slipped to the back of the house, to the small secondary door that led out from the storage room. It was rarely used in winter, but she knew its simple wooden latch like the back of her own hand. Driven by a love for the lost animal and a profound underestimation of the storm's power, she lifted the latch. The wind tore the door from her grasp, and she was sucked out into the screaming white abyss. "Snowdrop," she called again, but the wind snatched the name from her lips and flung it into the maelstrom. The cold was a physical blow, a stunning, brutal force that stole her breath and pierced through her clothes like 1,000 icy needles. She took a step, then another. Her small bare hands outstretched her world of darkness, now filled with a roaring, freezing chaos. Within seconds, the familiar shape of the house was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. She was adrift in a featureless void, the ground beneath her feet indistinguishable from the air around her. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through her desperate resolve. She turned, trying to retrace her steps, but there was no direction, no up or down, only the relentless, punishing wind and the suffocating, blinding white. She was lost. She was alone. And the blizzard in its terrible, indifferent power raged on. The world for Vivian had shrunk to the space of her own small, shivering body. The blizzard was a physical entity, a monstrous, living thing that sought to devour her. The wind was its voice, a constant, deafening roar that vibrated through her bones. The snow was its teeth, sharp and biting against the exposed skin of her face. She had lost all sense of time, all sense of direction. The image of Snowdrop, the catalyst for her foolish flight, had been bleached from her mind by the sheer overwhelming reality of her predicament. Now there was only survival. She stumbled forward, her bare hands held out in front of her, a futile gesture in a world without form. Her feet, clad only in thin leather shoes, were already numb, and the cold had begun its insidious creep up her legs. She knew with a chilling certainty that belied her years that to stop moving was to die. She had heard the stories. She knew what the cold did to a body. "Mama," she whimpered, the sound a tiny, pathetic thing against the storm's symphony of destruction. "Pa." Inside the Miller homestead, the discovery of her absence had unleashed a new, more terrible storm. Martha's initial shriek of pure, unadulterated terror had been followed by Elias's frantic, desperate search of the small house. When they found the back door swinging wildly on its hinges, a wave of cold, hard dread washed over them, a dread far colder than the blizzard itself. "Vivian!" Elias roared into the storm, his voice cracking with a father's primal fear. He made to plunge out into the white hell, but Thomas, his face a mask of youthful terror, grabbed his arm. "Pa, no. You'll be lost in seconds. We have to get a rope." They tied one end of a thick hemp rope to the heavy iron stove and the other around Elias's waist. He ventured out, a lone, desperate figure, fighting a losing battle against the elements, his calls for his daughter swallowed by the wind. He could see no more than a few feet in front of him, and the snow was already drifting up against the walls of the house, changing the familiar landscape into a treacherous alien terrain. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled back, inside his face a landscape of frozen tears and utter despair. He had found nothing. No sign. No track. No Vivian. Martha was on her knees by the fire, her body racked with sobs that seemed to be torn from the very depths of her soul. The warmth of the hearth felt like a cruel mockery in the face of the icy tomb that had swallowed her child. For Vivian, the struggle was becoming a losing one. Her movements were becoming sluggish, her thoughts slow and disjointed. The initial terror was being replaced by a strange, seductive numbness. The roaring of the wind was beginning to sound like a lullaby, a siren song beckoning her to lie down in the soft white drifts and sleep. It would be so easy, just to close her eyes. It was then, as she teetered on the precipice of surrender, that she heard it. It was a sound so alien to the storm's chaotic chorus that at first she thought she was imagining it, a phantom of her freezing mind. It was a note clear and high that seemed to dice through the wind's roar rather than be consumed by it. It was a human voice. She stopped, her head cocked, her entire being focused on that single, impossible sound. It came again, a series of notes that rose and fell in a haunting, unfamiliar melody. It was a song, but not like any song she had ever heard. It was wild and untamed, like the land itself, full of long, sustained notes that seemed to mimic the cry of a hawk or the howl of a wolf. Hope a tiny flickering ember in the vast, cold darkness of her despair was rekindled. Someone else was out here. Someone else was alive. "Hello," she called, her voice thin and reedy. "Is someone there?" The song stopped. For a moment, there was only the wind. Had she imagined it? Was she already lost to the delusions of the cold? Then a voice, closer than she expected, spoke. The words were strange, the language one she did not understand. But the tone was clear. It was a question. "Who are you?" The voice seemed to ask, the syllables sharp and clipped. "I'm Vivian," she cried out, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I'm lost." There was a pause, a silence filled only by the storm. Then she heard the crunch of snow, the sound of movement. A figure was approaching her, a shadow in her world of shadows. She could feel the subtle shift in the air. Pressure could smell the faint foreign scent of wood smoke and leather. A hand, surprisingly warm, touched her shoulder. She flinched, a small cry escaping her lips. The hand withdrew immediately. The voice spoke again, this time softer. The words still unintelligible, but the tone laced with something that sounded like reassurance. He was a boy. She could tell by the pitch of his voice. A Comanche boy. The thought sent a fresh jolt of fear through her, a fear born of the stories she had heard, whispered around campfires, and in the general store stories of raids and scalps and a savage, untamed people. Her father had always spoken of them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. "The Comanche are the lords of this land," he would say, "and we are trespassers in their kingdom." The boy spoke again, and this time he used a single word. She understood a word spoken in the broken English used by traders. "Lost, yes," she whispered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "I'm lost. I'm so cold." She felt the boy move in front of her. He gently took her hands in his. Her own were like blocks of ice, but his were warm, radiating a life-giving heat that seemed to seep into her frozen flesh. He said something else in his own language, then tugged gently on her hands. He wanted her to follow him. Fear warred with a desperate primal need for survival. To follow him was to step into an unknown far greater than the blizzard. But to stay here was certain death. The warmth of his hands was a powerful argument. She took a hesitant step, then another, her trust placed in the hands of a boy whose people were her people's sworn enemies. He led her slowly, carefully through the swirling chaos. He seemed to navigate the featureless landscape with an uncanny sense of direction, his steps sure and steady. The wind was still a physical assault, but with the boy's warm hands holding hers, it felt slightly less menacing. He was a small point of stillness in the heart of the storm, a single, unwavering anchor in the maelstrom. After a few minutes of slow, arduous progress, he stopped. He released one of her hands, and she heard a rustling sound. A moment later, a thick, heavy warmth was draped over her shoulders. It was a buffalo robe, heavy and smelling of smoke and animal musk. The thick fur was a shield against the wind's biting teeth, and for the first time since she had stumbled out of her home, a genuine warmth began to seep into her chilled core. She could not see her savior. She did not know his name or what he looked like. She only knew the warmth of his hand and the impossible gift of the buffalo robe. And then he began to sing again. His voice, no longer a distant echo, but a clear, resonant presence beside her, rose in the haunting melody she had heard before. It was a song that spoke of the wind and the ski and the endless plains. It was a song of his people, a song of survival, and in the heart of the White Death, for a blind girl, lost in a world of darkness, that song was the only light she had. It was a thread of sound in the void, and she clung to it as if it were life itself. He tugged her hand again, and she followed her steps, now more certain, her heart beating a steady rhythm in time with the Comanche boy's unrelenting winter's song. His name was Tuhkuma, which in the language of the Numunu, the people meant black horse. He was 12 summers old, and the blood of warriors flowed in his veins. His grandfather had been a great war chief, a man whose name was spoken with reverence around the winter fires. Tuhkuma was not yet a warrior, but he possessed the keen senses and the deep instinctual knowledge of the land that had been the birthright of his people for generations. He knew the subtle language of the wind, the shape of the land beneath the snow, and the paths the animals took. He had been checking his trap lines for rabbits when the blizzard, the Pohib-Itsua White Death, had descended with the suddenness of a striking eagle. He was not afraid. The storm was a powerful spirit to be respected, but not feared. He had found shelter in a small, ice-scoured ravine, a place his father had shown him, and had wrapped himself in the buffalo robe that was his constant companion in the cold months. It was from this shallow refuge that he had heard her cry, a thin, desperate sound that was almost lost in the wind's howl. He had found her stumbling in a circle, her sightless eyes wide with a terror that transcended the barriers of language and culture. He had seen the strange, milky color of her eyes, and understood. She was Pa-ka-tub-I without light. A deep instinctual pity, a feeling ingrained in his people's respect for the vulnerable, had moved him. Now, as he led her through the storm, he sang. He sang the songs his grandmother had taught him, songs that told the stories of his people, of their journeys, their battles, and their connection to the land. The songs were more than just melodies. They were maps, a way of placing oneself in the world when all landmarks were erased. The cadence of the song helped him maintain his own sense of direction, his own internal compass. But he also sang for the girl. He could feel the tremors of fear that still racked her small frame, and he sensed that the sound of his voice was a lifeline for her in her world of double darkness. Vivian, wrapped in the heavy warmth of the buffalo robe, listened to the boy's song with an intensity that bordered on reverence. She could not understand the words, but she could feel the story within them. There were parts that sounded like the thundering of buffalo hooves, others that were as soft and gentle as a summer breeze, and still others that held the sharp, piercing cry of a hunting hawk. The song was a landscape, a world of sound that she could see with her mind's eye. She held tight to his hand, a small, warm anchor in the vast, cold emptiness. His grip was firm and steady, and he moved with a confidence that was a stark contrast to her own faltering steps. He seemed to be reading the land with his feet, feeling the subtle dips and rises that were invisible to her, and she suspected to anyone with sight in this blinding whiteness. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice muffled by the robe. He paused his song and replied in his careful broken English, "My camp. Warm." Camp. The word conjured images from her father's stories, a collection of teepees, the smell of roasting meat, the sounds of a strange, guttural language. It was a place of the other, a place she had been taught to fear, but the boy's hand in hers, the robe on her shoulders, the song in her ears. These were real, tangible things that spoke not of threat, but of a strange and unexpected kindness. The journey was a blur of white noise and the boy's constant melodic voice. At one point, they came to a place where the wind was a physical barrier, a solid wall of force that threatened to tear them apart. Vivian stumbled and fell crying out as her knee struck something hard and frozen beneath the snow. Instantly, Tukuma was beside her. He knelt in the snow, his hands gently probing her leg. He spoke softly in his own tongue, the words a soothing murmur. Then, to her astonishment, he shifted his position, turning his back to her. He patted his shoulders, a clear invitation. Up. He said the single word a command, but not an unkind one. He wanted to carry her. The thought was both mortifying and deeply comforting. She was a burden, yet he was willing to take it on. Hesitantly, she wrapped her arms around his neck, and with a strength that surprised her in a boy so close to her own age, he stood lifting her onto his back. He wrapped the buffalo robe around them both, creating a small, shared cocoon of warmth. Now the journey was different. She was held close to his back, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the movement of his muscles as he pushed onward. And he began to sing again. His voice now a low rumble that vibrated through her body. It was a different song this time, slower, more rhythmic, a song of endurance. She did not know how long they walked. Time had lost its meaning. There was only the storm, the warmth of the boy's body, and the constant, reassuring presence of his voice. She found herself drifting not into the dangerous sleep of the cold, but into a state of strange tranquility. She was no longer afraid. She was with the singer, the boy whose voice was a shield against the storm. Finally, she felt a change in the air. The wind, though still strong, was less of a direct assault. They had entered some kind of shelter. She could smell the scent of wood smoke more strongly now, and the sharper, more pungent aroma of horses. Tukuma gently lowered her to her feet. She stood on ground that was still covered in snow, but it was sheltered out of the wind's direct path. She heard a soft nicker from a nearby horse. "We are here," Tukuma said. He led her forward a few more steps, and then they were passing through a flap of hide and into a space filled with warmth and the soft glow of a fire. The sudden cessation of the wind's roar was so profound that it left a ringing in her ears. She stood, blinking her sightless eyes, her senses overwhelmed. The air was thick with the smell of smoke-roasted meat and the unfamiliar scent of strange herbs. She could hear the crackle of a fire and the soft murmur of another voice, a woman's voice, speaking in the same language as the boy. She felt the heavy buffalo robe being lifted from her shoulders. The warmth of the teepee, for that is what she knew it must be, enveloped her, a blessed relief after the brutal cold. She heard the boy Tukuma speaking rapidly to the woman. His tone was urgent, explanatory. Then a new pair of hands, smaller and softer than the boy's, but just as warm, took her own. The woman spoke, her voice gentle. Vivian could not understand the words, but the tone was one of compassion. She was led to a pile of soft furs near the fire and gently pushed down to sit. A cup was pressed into her hands. It was warm, and the liquid inside was a savory, steaming broth. She drank it greedily, the hot liquid chasing the last of the deep-seated chill from her bones. She sat there, a blind white girl in a Comanche teepee, surrounded by the strange yet comforting sounds and smells of a people she had been taught to fear. She had been lost, a breath away from becoming another casualty of the great white death. And she had been saved by a a boy whose only weapon against the storm was a song. In the heart of the blizzard, a bridge had been built not of wood or stone, but of the simple, profound power of a human voice raised in the darkness. The woman was named Sikoni, or Morning Star. She was Tukuma's mother, a woman whose face was a testament to a life lived in harmony with the harsh beauty of the plains. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, held a deep well of sorrow for the life that was being stripped away from her people, but also an unyielding strength. She looked at the strange, pale-haired girl her son had brought out of the storm, and she saw not an enemy, but a child who was cold and afraid. She moved with a quiet grace, her hands deft and gentle as she removed Vivian's frozen shoes and stockings. She gasped when she saw the girl's feet, a deathly white, and already showing the telltale signs of frostbite. She clicked her tongue in a sound of pity and concern, and immediately set to work. She spoke to Tukuma in their own tongue. "Her feet are touched by the ice spirit. We must be careful, or she will lose them." Tukuma watched his young face, serious. He felt a strange sense of responsibility for this girl. He had pulled her from the storm's embrace, and now her fate was intertwined with his. Sikoni prepared a poultice of crushed herbs with a strong medicinal scent and began to gently massage Vivian's feet. Her touch firm, but incredibly gentle. Vivian flinched at the initial contact, a surge of pain, 1,000 tiny needles shooting up her legs. But as Sikoni continued her ministrations, the pain began to subside, replaced by a tingling warmth. Vivian sat by the fire, a silent, wide-eyed observer in her world of darkness. She was acutely aware of every sound, every movement in the teepee. She heard the soft whisper of Sikoni's deerskin dress as she moved, the quiet, rhythmic sound of her breathing, the occasional soft word she would murmur to her son. Tukuma sat on the other side of the fire, watching her. He was a boy of few words, especially in the clumsy tongue of the white settlers. He had done what was right, what any of the people would have done. But he was also curious. He had never been this close to a white girl before. He had seen them from a distance in the dusty, chaotic settlements that were springing up like ugly weeds on the prairie. But he had never spoken to one. He had only known the stories of his people, the tales of broken treaties, of the slaughter of the buffalo, of the relentless encroachment of the Tecanos, the white men. He saw the fear that still lingered in the taut set of her shoulders, in the way she flinched at any sudden sound. And he understood it. His people feared hers, and hers feared his. It was the way of things now. He decided to try to bridge the silence. He picked up a small, intricately carved wooden flute that lay beside his sleeping robes. He put it to his lips and began to play. The melody was different from the songs he had sung in the storm. It was a soft, gentle tune, a song that spoke of the quiet moments of life on the plains, the rising of the sun, the gentle flow of a creek, the dance of the stars in the vast night sky. Vivian's head lifted at the sound. The music was beautiful, a stark contrast to the wild, elemental songs of the blizzard. This was a song of peace, a song of home. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was a tear of gratitude, of relief, but also of a profound and aching homesickness. Sikoni, seeing the tear, made a soft cooing sound of comfort. She finished with Vivian's feet, wrapping them in soft, warm strips of rabbit fur. She then offered Vivian a piece of roasted rabbit meat on a flat piece of bark. The meat was tender and smoky, and Vivian, who had not realized how hungry she was, ate it with a quiet gratitude. As the night wore on, the storm continued its relentless assault on the world outside. But inside the teepee, a fragile truce had been declared. Vivian, her belly full and her body warm, began to relax. The fear that had been a cold, hard knot in her stomach began to thaw. She found herself listening to the quiet murmur of conversation between Tuhkuma and his mother, the strange musical cadence of their language no longer sounding threatening, but almost comforting. Later, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, Sikoni prepared a place for Vivian to sleep, a pile of thick, soft buffalo robes not far from the fire. As Vivian lay down, a wave of exhaustion deep and profound washed over her. She was safe. She was warm. She was just on the edge of sleep when she heard Tuhkuma speak, his voice soft in the quiet of the teepee. "Your song," he said, the English words careful and deliberate. "In storm." Vivian turned her head in the direction of his voice. "My song. No," he corrected himself. "My song. You hear Dum?" "Yes," she whispered. "I heard it. It was like a light." He was silent for a moment, and she could almost feel his surprise. A light? For a girl who could not see. He had not thought of it that way. For him, the songs were a part of the world, like the wind and the rain. But for her, they were something more. "I sing again," he said, not as a question but as a statement. And he did. He did not play the flute this time, but sang in a low, soft voice a lullaby that his mother had sung to him when he was a small child. It was a song about the stars, the tots, sigh, the silent watchers of the night. Vivian closed her eyes, her sightless eyes, and in her mind, she saw them. She saw the stars, great brilliant diamonds scattered across a velvet black sky. She saw them through the boy's song. She drifted off to sleep. Not in her own familiar bed in the small sod house, but on a pile of buffalo robes in a Comanche teepee, lulled to sleep by the voice of a boy who had been her enemy just that morning. The blizzard still raged, a white monster, clawing at the fragile walls of their shelter. But in the small, warm space, a blind girl and a Comanche boy had found a common language, a language not of words, but of song. A language that was beginning to melt the ice of fear and mistrust that had separated their two worlds. The silence was the first true gift of the new day. It was a presence, not an absence. A deep, resonant stillness that seeped into the teepee and settled over Vivian like a soft, weighted blanket. The great beast of the storm, whose roaring voice had been the only reality for 2 days, had finally been slain. For a girl who lived in a world of sound, this profound quiet was as dramatic and transformative as the rising of the sun. She lay perfectly still on her bed of furs, her ears straining, trying to pass the new language of the world. There was no wind clawing at the hide walls, no shrieking howl that vibrated through the ground. There was only the gentle, rhythmic crackle of the fire and the soft, even breathing of Sikoni nearby. "The storm," Vivian whispered into the quiet air, the words feeling loud and intrusive. "It's over." From across the teepee Tuhkuma's voice came low and affirming. "It is over. The sun comes." He had been awake for some time, watching the sliver of light at the smoke hole at the top of the teepee change from a dull grey to a brilliant, pearlescent white. The air itself tasted different, cleaner, sharper, stripped of the oppressive weight of the storm. A few hours later, after they had shared a simple meal of dried meat and warm broth, Seikone and Tukuma helped Vivian to the tipi entrance. As Tukuma pushed back the heavy hide flap, the intensity of the light made even Vivian, in her perpetual darkness, flinch and raise a hand to her face. It was not a light she could see, but one she could feel, a radiant energy that warmed her skin and seemed to press upon her eyelids. The air that rushed in was breathtakingly cold, so pure and frigid it felt like inhaling ice and diamonds. Tukuma led her out into this new world. The ground beneath her thin moccasins, a gift from Seikone, was soft and deep. The silence outside was even more immense, a vast, cathedral-like quiet that seemed to stretch to the ends of the earth. She imagined a world swathed in white, a pristine, unmarked blanket covering everything she had ever known. Tukuma described it to her in his careful, halting English, supplemented by Comanche words she was beginning to understand. He spoke of snowdrifts, as tall as a man on horseback, of the familiar ravine transformed into a smooth white canyon. He told her the sun on the snow was a tukapipuyu kwai, a white fire, so bright it hurt the eyes. His words painted a picture for her, a landscape built of sound and sensation. It was time to go home. The knowledge was a bitter-sweet ache in her chest, an almost desperate longing for her family, for the familiar smells and textures of her own small sod house, warred with a strange and powerful reluctance to leave this place of unexpected sanctuary, to leave the quiet strength of Seikone and the boy whose voice had become her light. Preparations for the journey were made with a solemn, practiced efficiency. Tukuma brought forth one of his family's horses, a sturdy piebald pony, whose soft wicker and warm grassy breath were a comfort to Vivian as she reached out to stroke its nose. He showed her the snowshoes he had fashioned for her from bent willow branches and strips of rawhide, a clever, practical design that would keep her from sinking into the deep snow. Seikone approached her, her movements as soft as the fall of an owl's feather. She knelt and gently took Vivian's feet in her hands. She unwrapped the rabbit fur bindings from the previous night and inspected her work. The skin was no longer the terrifying waxy white of frostbite, but a healthy pinkish color, though still tender. Seikone nodded a small sound of satisfaction in her throat, and carefully re-wrapped the feet in fresh, warm furs, before helping Vivian into the moccasins. Then Seikone pressed a small, tightly wrapped bundle of hide into Vivian's hands. It contained dried meat enough for a day's journey, and a smaller pouch that smelled strongly of the medicinal herbs she had used on Vivian's feet. It was a gift of healing, a parting gesture of profound care. Finally, Seikone stood and placed a warm, dry hand on Vivian's cold cheek. She began to speak, her voice a low, melodic murmur. The words were in the Numunu tongue, and Vivian understood none of them. Yet she understood everything. The tone was one of blessing, of sorrow, of a deep maternal tenderness that transcended language. It was the voice of a mother speaking to a child she had cared for, and was now sending back out into a dangerous world. Tukuma, standing beside them, translated his own voice, unusually subdued, as if humbled by his mother's solemnity. She says, the spirits watched over you in the storm. She says, you have a strong heart, like a winter bird that does not fly south. She prays your path home is safe. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes, hot against her cold skin. She could not articulate the depth of her gratitude. The words felt too small, too clumsy. Instead, she leaned forward and rested her head for a moment against the woman's shoulder, inhaling the scent of wood smoke and sage that clung to her deerskin dress. "Uha," she whispered the Comanche word, feeling more right, more true than any English she could have spoken. "Thank you." Sikoni's hand rested briefly on her corn silk hair, a final, gentle benediction. Tukuma helped her onto the pony's back, arranging her skirts and making sure she was seated securely. He then draped the heavy life-saving buffalo robe over her, its familiar weight and scent a final comfort. He took the pony's lead rope in his hand, and with a last nod to his mother, who stood watching from the entrance to the ravine, he led them out into the vast, white wilderness. The journey was a slow, deliberate march through a world of blinding light and profound silence. The sheer scale of the blizzard's aftermath was hard to comprehend. The pony's hooves sank deep into the snow with each step, and Tukuma, even with his own snowshoes, moved with a concentrated effort. Vivian, perched on the pony's back, felt entirely dependent on the boy in front of her. She held on to the pony's mane with one hand and kept the other tucked deep within the folds of the buffalo robe. Her entire being focused on the small, sturdy figure leading her onward. She had placed her life in his hands in the storm out of sheer desperation. Now she placed her trust in him, with a quiet, settled confidence. He was her eyes, her compass. He navigated the treacherous hidden landscape with an instinct that felt like magic. He would stop and point, telling her of a buried fence line or a deep, snow-filled gully that they needed to go around. He read the subtle contours of the drifts, the way the wind had sculpted the snow, and knew the safest path. And as they walked, he began to sing. It was not the urgent, desperate song of the blizzard, nor the soft lullaby of the teepee. This was a traveling song, a song of endurance and purpose. The melody was rhythmic, matching the plodding gait of the pony. The notes rose and fell with the contours of the land itself, a sonic map laid over the white emptiness. He sang of the journey of the sun across the sky, of the perseverance of the river that flows always to the sea, of the ancient paths his own people had walked across this land for generations. The song was her anchor. It filled the immense silence and pushed back the feeling of being a tiny, insignificant speck in a vast, indifferent world. It was a thread of connection, a constant reminder that she was not alone. She closed her eyes and let the music wash over her head, nodding slightly in time with the pony's steps. They had been traveling for what felt like an eternity when Tukuma suddenly stopped the pony and held up a hand for silence. His song died on his lips. "Listen," he commanded, his voice sharp with focus. Vivian strained her hearing, already so acute, reaching out into the stillness. There was nothing but the sigh of the pony's breath misting in the cold air, and the faint, almost imperceptible creak of leather. She was about to say she heard nothing, when a faint, distant disturbance touched the edge of her hearing. It was a sound that did not belong to the natural world. A shout, distorted by the snow-laden air, but unmistakably human. Hope, fierce and sharp, pierced through her. Could it be Pa? She breathed the name, a fragile question. Then it came again, clearer this time, a powerful male voice bellowing a name. "Vivian! It was him! It was her father! That's my father's voice!" she cried out, her body jolting with a surge of adrenaline and overwhelming relief. All the pent-up fear and exhaustion of the past days erupted in a single desperate cry. "PA! I'm here!" A second voice joined the first, younger, higher-pitched, cracking with adolescent emotion. "Vivian, is that you?" "Thomas!" She sobbed, her voice breaking. Tears, hot and immediate, streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "Thomas, I'm here." Tuhku-ma urged the pony forward, his pace quickening, moving towards the sounds. A few agonizing minutes later, two figures crested a large snowdrift, their forms dark and stark against the blinding white backdrop. They were running or trying to stumbling and plunging through the deep snow with a frantic, desperate energy. Her father, Elias Miller, reached her first. He looked like a wild man, his beard caked with ice, his eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out from sleepless nights of grief and terror. He didn't speak. He simply reached up his strong hands, spanning her waist, and pulled her from the pony's back. He crushed her to his chest in an embrace, so fierce it was almost painful, burying his face in her hair. Vivian felt the shuddering convulsions of his body as he wept, not with sound, but with great, silent, ragged gasps of a man who had stared into the abyss of unimaginable loss and had by some impossible miracle been given back his world. "Vivian." He finally choked out, his voice thick and unrecognizable. "Oh, my child. My girl. We thought you were gone." Thomas was there a second later, his lanky arms wrapping around them both, his own youthful attempts at stoicism collapsing into unrestrained sobs. The three of them clung to each other, a small island of impossible heart-shattering reunion in the middle of the vast white ocean of snow. After a long moment, when the first violent storm of emotion had passed, Elias slowly released her, though he kept a firm hand on her shoulder, as if afraid she might vanish. He looked her over, his hands brushing the snow from her hair, touching her face, assuring himself she was real whole. His gaze fell upon the rich, dark buffalo robe wrapped around her, and then for the first time he truly saw the silent, watchful figure standing beside the piebald pony. He saw a Comanche boy. The transformation in Elias Miller was instantaneous and profound. His face, which had been a canvas of pure, joyous relief, hardened. The soft lines of the weeping father vanished, replaced by the grim, wary expression of the settler, the man who had fought this land and its native inhabitants for his small patch of existence. Fear, suspicion, and a lifetime of ingrained prejudice rose like a phantom. His eyes narrowed, and his hand, almost of its own accord, moved to rest on the handle of the large hunting knife sheathed at his belt. It was a reflexive, instinctual gesture born of campfire stories and violent rumors. Vivian felt the shift immediately. The muscles in her father's arm tensed, the warmth of his relief replaced by a cold, dangerous stillness. She knew that look, that feeling, even without seeing it. It was the way her father became when he spoke of wolves or of the raids that had happened, a territory over. "No, Pa," she said, and her voice was not the reedy cry of a lost child, but a voice of surprising firmness and clarity. It was the voice of a girl who had walked through a storm and been led home by a song. She tightened her small hand on his powerful forearm, a gesture that was both a plea and a command. "He saved me." Elias looked down at her, startled by her tone. She turned her sightless eyes toward the space where she knew Tuhku-ma stood. "His name is Tuhku-ma," she said, speaking clearly and deliberately, wanting her father and brother to understand the truth of it, the weight of it. "The storm, I was lost. I would have died, Pa. He found me. He brought me to his camp, to his teepee. His mother, she was kind to me. She warmed my feet. He brought me home. She paused, then added the most important part. He sang to me, so I wouldn't be afraid. Elias's gaze shifted from his daughter's earnest, pleading face back to the Comanche boy. He looked at the boy's clothes, the deerskin and fur. He looked at the sturdy pony. He looked at the simple wooden flute tucked into the boy's belt. He saw no weapon, no malice. The boy did not flinch or look away under his hard, scrutinizing gaze. He stood tall, his chin slightly lifted, his dark eyes meeting Elias's with a quiet, unwavering dignity that spoke not of defiance, but of a simple, profound truth. Elias Miller was a hard man, forged by a hard land. But he was not an unjust one. The ingrained fear was a bitter taste in his mouth, but the evidence was right here, clinging to his arm, her heart beating against his ribs. His daughter was alive. She was warm in another's robe. The conflict within him was a silent, raging battle, but his love for his daughter was the stronger force. The truth in her words, in her fierce defense of her savior, was undeniable. Slowly, deliberately, he forced his hand away from his knife. He took a single, heavy step forward, closing the small gap between them. He extended his calloused, work-worn hand, not in aggression, not in suspicion, but in a gesture of peace. A gesture of a gratitude so immense it left no room for words. Tukuma watched the outstretched hand for a long moment. He understood the meaning. It was the gesture of the white man's truce. He saw the struggle in the man's eyes, the war between fear and thanks. With a solemn, almost imperceptible nod, he reached out and clasped Elias's hand. The grip was firm, brief, a fleeting moment of connection in the vast, snow-covered plains. But in that handshake, 1,000 stories of hatred and bloodshed were for an instant silenced. In that handshake, a father's boundless gratitude met a boy's quiet, unassuming courage. Tukuma did not linger. The reunion was a private, sacred thing, and he was an outsider to it. He gently pulled the lead rope from Vivian's grasp and backed the pony away. He gave a final small nod to her, a silent acknowledgement of the strange, powerful bond forged between them in the white heart of the storm. Then, without a backward glance, he turned, and with his pony in tow, began the long, solitary journey back to his own world. Vivian stood between her father and her brother, her head turned, listening. She listened to the soft, rhythmic crunch of the pony's hooves in the snow, a sound that grew fainter and fainter until it was finally swallowed by the immense, profound silence of the prairie. He was gone. She could no longer see her rescuer, could no longer hear him. But she knew with a certainty that went deeper than sight that a part of him would remain with her forever. The snow would melt. The prairie grasses would grow green and tall. Life would return to its familiar rhythms. But the memory of the Comanche boy's winter's song would never fade. It was now a part of her own inner landscape, a light that no darkness could ever extinguish, a testament to the moment when, in the midst of a terrible and unforgiving storm, the simple, profound kindness of a human heart had been more powerful than any blizzard. The story of Vivian Miller and Tukuma is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of compassion to transcend the deepest divides. It's a reminder that in the harshest of winters, a single act of kindness can be a beacon of light, a song of hope that can lead us home. Their journey through the blizzard was more than just a struggle for survival. It was a bridge built between two worlds, a fragile truce in a time of conflict. If this story of courage, connection, and the unlikely friendship between a blind settler girl and a Comanche boy has touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others. And for more true stories of the Wild West that explore the depths of the human experience, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these incredible narratives to life. Thank you for listening.